Okay, so we were up to doing the Imrei Yaakov um, on Yud Ches. Let me just read the halacha again. Melech v'chein melech shaharas batim ve'asa choma. If you have a king who demolishes houses or builds a wall and does so on someone else's property, oderech, or breaches a path along someone's property, mutar lehanosba, you're allowed to benefit from it. V'chein kol kayotze bazeh, and any other kind of land confiscation or manipulation, the king has a right to do this. That's provided that the king's currency is the current currency, meaning that his face is on the currency. Because the king's reign is done by consensus of the citizenry. And there's basically a tacit agreement that this is their king and they are subservient to him. Because if the king is not a legitimate king, which means that he's taken the monarchy by force without the consent of the citizenry, so then he's a gazlan anytime he does any kind of confiscation, and all of his representatives are gazlanim, right? But, that was, the whole controversy when people said, not my president, right? If you remember the division in the country. So that actually can cause tremendous social discord when there's such a perception. But of course, that was just a slogan. It wasn't reality because of, Trump or Biden or whoever's in the office are the legitimately elected leaders of the country. Okay, let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Melech, Kasvu HaTosfos, the Dafka B'malchei Akum Amrinan Dinan de Malchusadin. So we had touched upon this very, very lightly when we had seen a piece from this Rabbi Wasserman's book. We had pointed out that there is an opinion in the Rishonim that's known as the opinion of the Ran, but the Ran actually quotes Tosfos about it, that we only say that the law of the land is the law when we're dealing with Gentile monarchies. Because the basis for saying that the law of the land is the law is based on land ownership, meaning that anywhere on the planet Earth that is ruled over by a monarch or by any kind of government, there is an assumption that the property that I live on really is under the control of the king. And it's on that basis that the king has a right to institute laws, and that if I don't abide by those laws, the king can always confiscate my property. Aval b'malchei Yisrael lo, but the only place on the planet where that principle does not apply is in the land of Israel, because the land of Israel does not belong to a monarch. Lifi sheretz Yisrael kol Yisrael shutafim ba, because in the land of Israel, all Jews are considered to be joint partners in ownership of the land, unlike anywhere else on earth. And basically, you may hear this as a justification at some point. Someone wishes to tell you, well, you have to obey the law of the land in Chutz La'aretz, but you don't have to obey the law of the land in the land of Israel because the government has no authority. And I can assure you that this argument has been attempted by many people who would like to disregard Israeli law. But of course, first of all, that's only one opinion. It's the opinion of the Ran, and there are other Rishonim who opine that the basis for listening to the law of the land is not because of land ownership of the monarch, but rather a tacit consent of the people who wish to live in the land to obey the law. But even according to the opinion of the Ran, V'shailos Utshuvas Chasam Sofer Kosav, the lo ka'amar Haran b'shem hatosfos, elo b'masim umecha shemalti al korcham. But the Ran then writes, the Chasam Sofer writes that the Ran only said that there are limitations to Dina de Malchusa Dina in the land of Israel, only with regard to the payment of taxes. Because it's legitimate to say that the payment of taxes is something that everyone agrees to, because they all know that they could be ejected from the land. And therefore, if you wanted to make a distinction between the land of Israel and Chutz La'aretz, that makes sense. But let's say when it comes to statutes and laws, let's say traffic laws or conventions of how to make transactions, or having to record sales in a land registry, or any other kind of convention or legal mechanism that is instituted by the government, right? Then Modeh Haran, the Hatam Mishum Denichalu, then even the Ran will agree that there's no difference between the law of the land in Israel versus the law of the land anywhere else. In other words, let's say the government says that whenever you want to make a sale or a purchase, you have to do it in a certain way. You have to register it. You have to, right? Those things, even the Ran would agree that there's no difference between the land of Israel and anywhere else. Let's say, what is a permitted substance? What is not a permitted substance? If you purchase a firearm, you have to register it with the government, and so forth and so on. So there really is no distinction. The only distinction can be made is, can I be forced to pay my financial obligations to a government that does not have the same standing in Israel as it does in Chutz La'aretz because of land ownership? That's the only ramification. But as far as conventions of civilization, of civil behavior, social norms, that any government can institute, not because they own the property, but rather because there is a sense of consensus that everyone in the citizenry recognizes that we need a government in order to impose social norms. And even if I don't particularly agree with one particular social norm, but the fact that I've chosen to live in this land means that I've tacitly consented to abide by the social norms of the society in which I live, independent of who owns the property. Okay? And in the Sefer Pischei Choshen, which we've made reference to before, it's a very helpful sefer that does a very similar project to the Imrei Yaakov, which basically elaborates on the halachas and Shulchan Aruch and Choshen Mishpat. He writes, "Sha'af im nomar she'itzadina de malchusa lo shayach be'eretz Yisrael." He says, even if we were going to argue that the Dina de Malchusa Dina does not apply in Eretz Yisrael because of the Ran's argument, because the government does not own the property. He says, but that's only when a king rises to power without the consent of the people, because basically it's a monarchy, right? But let's say it's a democracy, and there are elections, and through those elections, the political leaders are chosen. So he says, Yesh makom lomer sha'al kol panim ein dino kegazlan. Then there's even more of a reason to argue that people have to comply with taxation as well, because this is done by consensus. It's done by common consensus. Even if he doesn't get a majority of the vote, but if he gets the largest amount of the vote, it is the citizenry itself that has appointed this person and basically agreed that people have to pay their taxes to that government. But there's a counter argument to make. He says, but one could argue that any government body that does not comport itself according to the laws of the Torah, which means if they tell you that you have to do something, or that the government is going to do something which is contrary to Torah law, perhaps you don't have to abide by laws of taxation, and you don't have to abide by the particular laws which they tell you to do. Which, of course, is the argument if you hold that being part of the Israeli army is against the Torah, or if they or if the government were to tell you to wear or dress according to a way which you feel is against the Torah. So then you could argue that you're not obligated to listen to the government. But that's a lengthy conversation having to do with the Dina de Malchusa in Eretz Yisrael, which I think we're not going to get into at this point today. Od Kassav, he further writes, the Efshir de Lagabi Chukim Hanogim Lishmira al Hanefesh V'Haruchush Kagon Chukei Tenua B'Chayotze Bazeh. He also writes in that very same essay, in that sefer, that when it comes to laws that address the public safety, okay, and laws of property transfer and ownership, and so one example of this would be traffic laws, right? Let's say the government has rules on how fast you're allowed to go, how you're allowed to drive, what kind of vehicle you're allowed to have on the road, and things like that. Then everywhere you have to obey the law of the land, because that's independent of ownership and finance, because that's for the protection of the citizenry. And there, Dina de Malchusa would apply everywhere. Now, I want to focus on this for a little bit, because this has relevance for our current dilemma, our social dilemma, where the government has imposed restrictions and laws based upon their perception of how to control the pandemic and bring the numbers down of infections in society. There would be some kind of implication over here. It has been argued that Dina de Malchusa Dina does not apply if it's not an issue of finance. That's been an argument that's been bantied about. Well, if that's the case, then that would essentially imply that any rule that the government makes that is outside the rubric of finance, I don't have to listen to. So if the government says that certain drugs are not legal substances, I don't have to listen. If the government says that I'm not allowed to engage in certain activities, right, because of public safety, I'm not allowed to have certain weaponry, I'm not allowed to do this or that, I can't own a gun, so that's beyond a certain type, I don't have to listen to those because it's got nothing to do with finance. But here, the Imrei Yaakov quotes the Sefer Pischei Choshen, which we'll, God willing, take a look at tomorrow, just to the opposite, that even where Dina de Malchusa, it might be argued, does not apply like in Eretz Yisrael, you still have to obey laws that were designed to protect the public good. And I'll try and find that source for you tomorrow. We'll take a look at it more carefully. Od Kassav Sham B'Daf Yud Ches L'Chol Masha Danu HaPoskim Hu Lahavriach V'Lo L'Shalem HaMeches. And he also writes that all of the arguments that permit being more lenient about Dina de Malchusa Dina in Eretz Yisrael are only to help a person passively avoid his financial obligations. Abolahotzi Shalokidin, but to steal, to proactively take money from others or from the government by lying or violating the law, let's say to get a government grant, right, by lying and filling out a form saying that you qualify when you really don't. That there's absolutely no permissibility, especially if you have to falsify and lie, right, and say, I qualify for welfare, let's say, when you really don't. The Kimi Pneishu who Gazlan Mutter Ligzol Mimenu, he says, what, just because someone is a Gazlan, you're allowed to steal from them? And I've heard people try to rationalize this, but there's absolutely no basis in halacha to rationalize such activity. And we'll continue this Amir Hashem tomorrow. But as I mentioned, for those who came on a little bit late, unfortunately on Mondays I have to stop quite early during COVID because I have to make the 7 o'clock minyan to be able to make my next class, and I have to catch up with the davening because they start at Yishtabach at 7. So I hope you'll forgive me. We'll continue Amir Hashem tomorrow, and I want to focus on this issue carefully. All right, take care, everybody.